Thank you all for being here. This is the final reading of the Furious Flower Poetry Center, and we are so excited to be celebrating the winners and the judge of our first annual Furious Flower Poetry Prize. JMU students and affiliates, we're very sorry the Commonwealth will not let us allow you to participate in submitting to the prize. However, we definitely are so excited to be able to bring you guys, as we continue to do all throughout the year, quality poets, amazing poets. You're going to hear tonight from an award-winning, 21-book-having, awesome human being of a poet, as well as the two young emerging poets that she selected as our prize winner and honorable mention. How many of you have heard of Fierce Flower before? Okay, so we have a lot of newbies in the room. So Fierce Flower is a center here on JMU's campus, and we are the first center in the nation for African American poetry. Our mission is to educate people about the vibrancy of Black poetry, to promote poets by things like our prize, which encourage young poets to send out their work, to write, to encourage them. We bring them here for readings, to share their work with you, give them opportunities, and also to preserve the really wonderful and rich history of Black literature. And one of the places you can see that is here on our very own special collections library, where the Fierce Flower archives are housed currently. We've got all sorts of cool stuff over there. And so we are a really wonderful resource here on campus. Feel free to come to our readings. We have about 3 a semester. We have events for undergraduates. About 3 weeks ago in March, we had a collegiate summit. Again, we had 3 wonderful poets. Who was at the collegiate summit? I see some heads. Oh, yeah, some hands. We had said, was it awesome or was it awesome? It's pretty awesome. We had 3 poets. You guys, the poets did workshops with the students, gave talks that were really phenomenal. So again, please sign up for our listserv. You just look up JMU Furious Flower, and you'll be kept abreast with not a lot of email because we don't have a lot of time. So we just send you the important notices, the things you need to know about what's happening and when. The founder of this amazing center is Dr. Joanne Gabbin. Who's in Dr. Gabbin's class? I know you're here, all right. She is the founding director of the Fierce Flower Poetry Center, and I'm going to have her come and introduce our judge, Marilyn Nelson. Please welcome Dr. Gabbin.
Thank you. That's Alleyne, our wonderful assistant director of the Furious Flower Poetry Center, and a world-class poet in her own right. It is wonderful, wonderful to see you all. This is a good group. This is pretty good for the second week in April. Those people who are not here are going to miss it. Isn't that right, Deborah? Yes. I tell you, the reason I think I had the nerve to bring the Furious Flower concept here to JMU is that we have students here, and we've had students over the last 24 years who love poetry. And even if they don't love poetry, they're open to understanding it and trying to love it. And so it's always a pleasure when I look out and I see faces of people who are here just for the joy of words. And it makes me feel just absolutely fabulous. I am so excited to introduce my friend, Marilyn Nelson. The last time she came to Furious Flowers for the 2014 Furious Flower Conference. And at that time, she bedazzled us with poems from Seneca Village, as I remember. And then there was a time before, some of my students are going to say, she's not going to remember that, but there was a time before when she came and she did her poems on Carver, A Life in Poems, and also Fortune's Bones. And I remember how mesmerized those students were over on the other side of campus in Madison 405. I remember the place. I remember what you did. at that time. You were absolutely fantastic. So when we reached out to you to be the judge for this, our first Furious Flower Prize, Poetry Prize, and you said yes, I was so delighted. We do happy dances at the Furious Flower Poetry Center, and that was one of the happy dances. This woman that you're going to hear later, she'll be our last reader because that's the protocol. You always save the best for last. But I'm introducing her now because she will be coming up to introduce our winners. And I want to introduce her this way. Yusef Kamanyaka says of her work, her words teach us how to praise ourselves by praising each other. The Image Journal writes, American history as conceived by Marilyn Nelson is the inside-out, last shall be first version. She inhabits the voices of the overlooked and the disenfranchised and shines light into forgotten corners that reveal essential truths about the whole. But if she is a revisionist historian's poet, she is also a child's poet, a mother's poet, a housekeeper's poet, and a scientist's poet. It's this breadth of perspective from pole to pole, past to present, from spheres domestic to atmospheric, that make her so remarkable. Marilyn Nelson is also an open-handed citizen of the nation of writers. And I would say, just from a personal perspective, she's the poet I often go to, the same way I go to Lucille Clifton, the same way I go to Gwendolyn Brooks, when I need to have a word that sounds sincere and that has, I suppose, that part that I hold so dear, and that's the passion for life and understanding of the preciousness of life. So in January, in celebrating the birthday of Martin Luther King, I went to the sonnets, a wreath for Emmett Till. And Marilyn, I just read one sonnet. And before I finished, I knew that every person in that room was with me. And every person in that room understood how this boy who was sacrificed was the catalyst for really the burgeoning of what we call the modern civil rights movement. And just the other day, when I was in Chicago, and we wanted to remember the death of Martin Luther King, I thought of a Marilyn Nelson poem. And I want to share just a little bit of that poem with you. And it's one of the poems that is a favorite in my class at this point. It's Not My Bones. And why did I choose that one? Because Martin Luther King would be 89 years old if he had lived. But his body, his flesh, is gone. His bones might even be pulverized. But his spirit is still here. And his spirit is helping us through these dark days that we are facing at this particular point. So we go back to the wisdom that he taught. We go back to the love that he preached. We go back to the understanding that we are not simply bones and flesh, that we are spirit and soul. And that's what Marilyn Nelson does for me with this poem, Not My Bones. I'm not going to read it all, just in case you wanted to read that one, Marilyn. You can own somebody's body, but the soul runs free. It roams the night sky's mute geometry. You can murder hope. You can pound faith flat, but like weeds and wildflowers, they grow right back. For you are not your body. You are not your body. You are not your body. You are not your bones. What's essential about you is what can't be owned. What's essential in you is your longing to raise your itty-bitty voice in the cosmic praise. For you are not your body. You are not your body. Well, I woke up this morning just so glad to be free, glad to be free, glad to be free. I woke up this morning in restful peace, for I am not my body. I am not my bones. I am not my body. Glory, hallelujah. I am not my bones. I am not my bones. Would you welcome to the podium the woman who wrote that poem, Marilyn Nelson.
Thank you, Professor Gabbin. I am very pleased to be here to introduce the winners of the Furious Flower Poetry Prize. And I think I will introduce the runner-up first and ask you to come and read, and then I'll come up again and introduce the second person. So I'm going to introduce first Keith Wilson of Chicago, who is the honorable mention poet of the 2018 Furious Flower Poetry Prize. You have this on your program. Keith is an Afro-Latin poet, a Cave Canem Fellow, and a graduate of the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop. He has received 3 scholarships from Breadloaf, as well as scholarships from McDowell, UCross, Millay Colony, and the Vermont Studio Center, my favorite, among others. Keith's first book, Field Notes on Ordinary Love, will be published by Copper Canyon in 2019. So he's well on his way. I am going to read the blurb that I wrote to go on. No, it's the blurb for this, not for the book. And it's sometimes annoying when people quote from your poem when you're planning to read it. Oh, sorry, Keith. Got a lot of quotes here. Because I was so struck by many just wonderful phrases in this one poem. The poem is called 53rd Street, and I'm going to read 6 phrases from that poem. A parking lot stricken with midnight. The resignation of the trees. A billboard that slips into the sky. A battalion of hearts. A weed that dandelions up the hill. We mustard seed the earth. What delicious phrases. I loved this poet's adaptation of one of our people's colloquialisms, which I've heard but never seen in print before, in the phrase, might could have saved a child. Might could have saved a child. I so enjoyed, though I find it hard to believe, sharing in this poem the rare privilege of walking without fear, acquainted with the night, in an apparently American city at midnight. So we'll now hear from Keith Wilson. I think I am allowed to give this to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I wanted to make sure that I thanked Dr. Gabbin and Marilyn Nelson. Thank you so much, and all of Furious Flower. Today has been so awesome. It's felt like being a rock star, which is very rare in my experience as a poet. I'm going to read a few poems. This first poem that I'm going to read is about my dad, and the ways in which, so my dad's father physically abused him, which is a thing that he would probably never say. But you can hear in this poem some of the things that happened to him that he's told me very matter of fact, like that's just the way things are. And my dad, I always felt was very harsh with me, but he was never as harsh as his father was. And I just find it interesting that a lot of times that's the way that things are passed down, that hopefully the things that I think he was harsh about, I will be better at, but I'm sure there are other things that I'm also passing on. And so this is called The Way That I Hold My Hands. I can't imagine my father wishing he would rather be anything. Once upon a time, he was a watermelon growing from a box. His mother died. His father beat the blood out of him, and teardrops dripped black from his face into his food. My father's father made him eat his dinner through himself, the Miracle Whip salad spangled like dew in the garden. This isn't a figure of speech. My father ate his blood. It's hard to think he must have been young. He made me stop all my life. He told me not to be a girl. Whatever I was doing, of course I stopped. Sorry. He kissed me on the top of the head before I went to bed each night. He was always there. He read to my brother. He read to me from a book of animals. This is a fox's paw. This is a bear's. He told me, I'll give you something to cry about. But he never touched me. Bear claw, I said. Winters are easier for bears. I spread my fingers over his. No, my father said. So this next poem, I write a lot about love, and I have a lot of like partially finished poems, like a whole lot of them. And so I was going through some love poems, and post-election, I was also writing about love. Didn't feel right in that moment, and so I ended up revising some of those love poems to different kinds of poems. So this is still a love poem, but it's also something else, and it's called Treatise on Fallen Fruit. Sleep, and that's all we did. We perfected a way of leaning like beams on the verge of ambulance. Slept in the shared carriage of the couch, the television orange as a deer's mouth. A missing student, white noise from falling cities, and her lips overpoured with salt. Tomorrow will work itself out. The world sways between the quiet and guided disasters, like fireworks, like the heart. Then smoke in the night. We always found the paths back into each other's arms. On my way home to you, the car pulled past the overcast of Lake Michigan, and I could tell by the color of the water that we had bombed Syria. However this started, it is also about drones making light of men, like this does. Whether or not we mean for it, the car glides under the bridge where Brown lives. I'm coming back to curl next to you, for sleep to dangle like playthings from our arms. In good years like this, we buy flowers. I might wake by the fire first and look for your word, and whatever you were saying in your sleep couldn't possibly be. Imagine this is a canoe. I drag my thoughts behind me like an arm in the water or a fuse. You know the throat of the world too is brown. If there is a God, some secret weekend exists where he sleeps with his legs stretched like this upon an impossible couch. Neither do we distinguish between love and hush. Did I tell you they stopped reporting after the very first day? I looked every night. On the one hand, we test the limits of passion, and on the other, the limits of history. This afternoon, they found the black boy's arms and legs in the lake. After that, the children played in the water. Then it got to be late. The police ask again for us to leave. We pack our things into the smalls of our backs. We move hellishly slow, the light from an explosion. This next poem is one of the poems that Furious Flower is recognizing. It's called 53rd Street. So I live in Chicago. I live on 53rd Street. And until very recently, I worked at a grocery store. I worked third shift. And so a little about 53rd Street, it's heavily gentrified. It's part of the University of Chicago campus. And so there are a lot of people living with homelessness living on that street. There's also just a lot of people passing out things, asking for people to sign surveys, to help in protests about buildings being torn down, that are part of the community, to be replaced by Five Guys and Subways and things. And then there's just like a lot of people, there are a lot of students who go to that street to hang out. It's like where the theater is. And then there's a lot of people who actually live in the South Side from the moment they were born until today, who come up north a little bit to hang out there as well. So it's like a very bustling street, and it's actually really hard for me to walk down that street sometimes. I'm shy and socially anxious sometimes, and so even like just people asking me to sign things can be kind of overwhelming. And so working this third shift job, I'm a lot of times coming home. I was a lot of times coming home where the streets were totally empty, and I began to write a poem about what a blessing that is. And upon like further reflection, realizing the ways in which my ability to walk home at night and feel like it's a blessing has a lot to do with the way I look and who I was born as. This is a thing, even the fact that I was working third shift, the other women and trans women who are working at that store don't work third shift because they can't walk home at night. So it's a poem that deals with all of that. It's called 53rd Street. Thank you for this empty street, for a parking lot stricken with midnight and not another voice, not even a politeness, only the resignation of the trees, harmless and navy blue and royal. Bless this walk, just mine, and the animal that orchestrates the shadow. Thank you for each blonde saucer of light that dips beneath me as if I were the president of this timid land. For this blessed movement, legs that let spread proudly as an occupation, a seat on the bus. If it was earlier in the evening, the streets would throb, and a man might ask me for help. I'd admit I have no money, save nothing. I say I'm sorry a dozen times a day, as if I can hardly be bothered with sacrifices that aren't worn around the neck. I think about neckties too, ever since I invested in a future and thought. Thank you for this stubble and night, unconfined. It is hard to not be grateful for being able to walk like this, alone but unaware of how I cannot be alone. The dark within me that scares other men just enough. How my arms let me be single. How the register of my voice is a foregone conclusion, like the desk reminding a white of its black. How a sign that says, "Beware of dog," is enough to make a man move on to the very next house. Chicago is still for me. I get to be a boy on this street. It's as good as being young, when grown folks are mountains that block other mountains, or men that wrestle with their God. And I am unaware of my advancing the impasse under which an omen sleeps. Only once, I beat blood from my brother's nose as if he was whole wheat dough. He became a rose that overtook me. Lord, I am a ministry. I am a billboard that slips into the sky and a mythical bird. I am a battalion of hearts, and the street is a parade that I know is just a street, but listen, isn't a metaphor a promise? I swear that what seems at first to be is not. My Adam's apple is an inauguration. I'm thankful to not be afraid, though I slip closer to it every year. I worry that I am old enough to trade making light of my own permanence for the permanence of my own light. That what has already passed is past. That what I say is more important to hear than to keep. I can't remember how I used to pray. Directly, I think, instead of this. On this street, I can be both a memory of smallness and a behemoth, worry past nothing, every alcove, only the bodies and the blankets and my hotness through butter. Even the boyish violences that made me afraid are good to me. The streets where I cut myself on dares, saw dogs raised in the air like sails, all of us traveling by our necks, swaddled in the air, our swaddled tenors beneath us. We peered into the open composition of a bird that had been taken from a blue movement to a sidewalk that was not wet enough to reach us, but too wet for us to touch. Thank you. Thank you. And my very last poem, the name of the manuscript that I have coming out is called Field Notes on Ordinary Love. And this is sort of the title poem. It's called Field Notes. It began as me writing a bunch of notes about blackness and all the different things that black means. And I began to realize that it sort of became a lot of problematic scenarios that happened to me in different fields in my life. So I grew up in Kentucky. And so this is a poem that deals with that. Field Notes. 1. In physics, dark matter isn't made of anything. It's a free citizen that passes unburdened through the field, through itself, through you. 2. It helps to observe from a distance, the field, for instance, as a statement the South has chosen to make. The way whiteness, too, is often rhetorical, as when an older student remarks that in those beginning days, only he observed MLK's holiday, while his black friends working did not. 3. Sometimes love is a black dot in a field. Sometimes, suddenly, it is not. 4. Or how can black be the absence of all color? Take this cruiser. See the light strike blue off the car like copper through a fountain. 5. There's a difference between what is fair and what is just. For instance, it is fair that I try to love your skin even when it is not touching my own. 6. Whiteness is an alibi, the way the officer was like a steamliner only I could see. 7. Inside where nothing shows, I am of course not black, but that does not matter to the field. 8. Some colors are indistinguishable at night. Put your hands behind your back, a different cop once asked me. It was so sincere. He was so polite. 9. As a boy, you learn to know the inside without being required to feel it, as when now I understand a bucket or a hood. 10. He asks my girlfriend not if she is white, since even in this light, what we are is obvious, but instead he speaks philosophically. Ma'am, he asks, are you here of your own free will? 11. Sometimes whiteness is a form itself of hyperbole. Try this. Sit in a field, then try reading Andrew Jackson's quotes on liberty, only pretend they are being written by his slaves. 12. Look at the word black on the paper, and you will see a certain black, a kind, a certainty. Or if you see nothing at all, that of course is a kind of black too. 13. By the road, my father showed me cotton once. Look at that, he said. Thank you guys.
So I now get to introduce the winner of the Furious Flower Prize, Heather Treseler of Newton, Massachusetts. Oops, excuse me. Heather is the winner of the 2018 Furious Flower Poetry Prize. A poet and essayist, her work has appeared in the Harvard Review, Missouri Review, Southern Poetry Review, Boston Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and 4 books about post-war American poetry. She's a recipient of the George Alden Award for Excellence in Teaching. She is an associate professor at Worcester State University, where she teaches creative writing and American literature. I decided to award first prize to Heather because of a sequence of 3 poems she submitted called Beaux Arts. And my I read all of these poems several times, and my initial impression of Heather's poems didn't change on subsequent readings. My initial response was, "Oh, I wish I had written those," because they taught me something about history and about art. Interested myself in poems about both of those things, history and art. So I'm going to read the blurb I wrote about Heather's 3 poems from the sequence called Beaux Arts. I've never given much thought to American painter John Singer Sargent, though I do remember his framed museum portraits of beautifully dressed ladies I associate with the works of Henry James. In these poems, we enter Sargent's world at the invitation of Thomas McKellar, the beautiful African-American elevator operator whom Sargent frequently painted or sketched, often nude. This sequence of skillfully crafted ekphrastic historical poems introduces McKellar as muse and as model, depicting him as seen through the artist's eyes and seeing his sense of himself as a working man in an indifferent, if not downright hostile, world. Without taking an explicit side in the contemporary controversy about Sargent's sexuality, the poet presents both the artist's intimate scrutiny of the dark splendor of McKellar's body and McKellar's dispassionate willingness to sell the sight of his nakedness for the sake of art. Having introduced Sargent in 2 poems, the poet follows him into a third, based on one of Sargent's masterpieces, a group tableau of 4 young sisters, children of Sargent's friend Edward Darley Boyd. As a friend of the family, Sargent knows of the silence of adult secrets that press down around the small. The secret pressing down around these girls is the memory of their parents' firstborn, who lives in a home for feeble-minded idiot children. I'm quoting from the poems here. Whether true or invented, the backstory the poet's Sargent tells of the shadow cast by this unforgotten brother who is tended by the best rote kindness money can buy, is delicately and touchingly told. So I am awarding this prize for the skillful and intimate and knowledgeable poems about the painter John Singer Sargent. And again, I was especially moved by his relationship with his model, Thomas McKellar. So this is Heather Treseler, and we hear her read. Sorry, I thought this had fallen off of my chest, but it hadn't. So. Congratulations.
So I need to begin by thanking all of you for coming on what's turned out to be an absolutely beautiful afternoon in Virginia. And I want to thank quite deeply Marilyn Nelson, whose work I've been reading with great admiration for a good 20 years. And I have been quietly fangirling all day, just sort of aghast that I'm in her presence. I also want to thank very sincerely the Furious Flower Poetry Center founder and executive director, Joanne Gabbin, for hosting us, but also too, in showing us in the center how a very big dream might become a very material reality. And her center shows us, I think, how vital a voice poetry might have in our body politic at large, as well as at and in our universities. I also want to thank my colleague Keith Wilson, whose work is just beginning its meteoric rise, for his conversation these past 2 days, and Professor Lauren Alleyne, another poet whom we will all one day say that we knew. And also Ashley Ratliff for organizing our stay so flawlessly and graciously. As Marilyn Nelson mentioned, I'll be reading poems from my manuscript in progress, which does have a section about this Anglo-American painter, John Singer Sargent, and his African-American model, Thomas E. McKellar, whose portrait, for a wide variety of reasons, did not appear in a museum until 1986. I was about 8 years old the first time I saw it, and I was full of questions, as well as admiration for it. Sargent was famous for painting the rich and the famous at the turn of the 20th century. But between 1917 and 1920, he paid Thomas McKellar to pose for him many times as he completed large-scale murals at the Boston Public Library and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. McKellar was an elevator operator in a hotel, the Copley Plaza, and Sargent recruited him to serve as his model. So this sequence imagines how the artist and the subject might have regarded each other in those years. Beaux Arts, in the voice of Sargent, painting nude study of Thomas McKellar. And I'll say as a quick aside, his mural inside the Boston Public Library is titled The History of Christianity, and it starts with Adam and Eve. I needed a black man to imagine Adam. I needed someone I could pay to pose in the most exposed position for hours without complaint. I wanted the hotel elevator man, Thomas McKellar, whose broad, defined chest I studied in close detail. How the clavicle's little key pins a man's head to its runaway body, locks the pectoral door to the heart. How a pelvic girdle ushers the eye down to the sex. I needed time, hours of close gazing, to trace the calf muscle's fierce tie to delicate Achilles, vestige of man's origin as finned fish, Homo habilis, gradual ascent to gonads and glands. Raised with knowledge of sin, man's seasons of acute temptation, I trace my model's warm leg with the thick of my rough paint-daubed hand before I track, brush across canvas. Thomas accepts my touch, the intimate scrutiny one body can make of another. And I, Sargent, the irony of my surname, never keener than now, paint the dark splendor of Adam's groin as he turns to flee through the gate of the forbidden garden, chased by a white angel or incubus. This is titled Cable and Shaft, and as I told Professor Gabbin this morning in writing this poem, I had to do a lot of research about turn-of-the-century elevators, which has since made me very hesitant to get onto elevators. And this is in the voice of McKellar. What men do in hotels is the Lord's business. My business to avert my eyes. Elevators are delicate machines. Their business, ascension. Each day in uniform, I offer men the easier stair, and they trust my rheostat and motor, my grasp, their gravity, delivery to a desired floor where rich Persian carpets loll tongues at their slippered feet. A man can be undone by luxury as poverty. One beats a man slowly down to the marrow of bone. The other cloaks him in such pillow and perfume, he forgets the smell of his own sweat. Back home, arms as tired as the muscles in my face, stiff from all the smiling and unsmiling, the pulling at levers, I kiss my wife who says, taking my check, I'm in the business of lifting men up. But this job isn't sacred. It's indoors. So I stay warm come winter while other men crack bleeding hands handling pig iron in cold, shoveling coal, patching old bridges and roads. Those same men sweat like mules in summer, doing every little thing white men won't deign. Whereas I ride a column of air, shaft, cable, cab, Teagle engine, counterweights, and steam. I pay no mind to floozy women who visit floor 9, nor Jim Curley's flunkies, coats lined with cash and gift tobacco. Mr. Sargent was different, polite, British-like, not one for banter. He did not ask for favors or send for girls. So I was startled when he asked to see me about a business matter. I'll pay you for your shoulders, he said, straight-faced, the day we met, and he explained his purposes. All days, all weather, I wear worsted wool, starched collars. No one save Amelia has seen me without trousers. But Mr. Sargent paints scenes of the unseen, mythological. And I, who know how to avert my eyes while men tend to their affairs, let him see my naked flesh and bones, and then I turn and take good money home. This is the daughters of Edward Darley Boyt, and Marilyn did all my introductory work for me, which is great. No, it's great. So they're these 4 daughters. They're featured in a Parisian foyer, looking rather awkward and uncomfortable and disconnected from each other. And I did a bit of research about the Boyt family, only to learn that their eldest had been institutionalized and died in that institution in the Berkshires 18 years later, and was in fact buried on the grounds of the institution apart from his siblings. In the shadowed foyer on Avenue de Friedland, 4 pinafores play against the light. Isa, Florrie, Jane, and Julia stand in quartet around a silence of adult secrets that press down around the small. Ghosts are gorillas, girls less so. In all this time of standing or sitting like statuary while I affix their likeness to my canvas, not one has spoken of little Ned, the unforgotten brother, who lives in a home for feeble-minded idiot children far from this prettied lane in Paris, where their father, my old friend, plays at painting, traipsing collie-like after his rich wife in rounds of theater and croquet. No one speaks of Ned, the firstborn, whose tongue dropped like an apple, shorn from the tree of thought. At 2 years, Ned was a handsome, normal child. Overnight, he lost the will to speak, an interest in anything but a small stick, a pile of sand. He no longer cried out, not even for his mother. Ned lives in a simple room tended by the best rote kindness money can buy. Forsaken namesake, first failure, boy turned cabinet of neurologic curiosity. And these 4 daughters, born against that fate, whom their mother spoils badly, none will marry, each will live oddly, moneyed and but for my painting, lost in the annals. Okay. I think I have time for just a little bit more. Yeah, okay. So, inspired by Keith's gorgeous love poems, I'm going to read a poem that is about the blizzard of 1978, which is the storm to which I owe my origin as a person. And since I think, knock of all available wood, we're past the snow point of the year, this hopefully won't induce any traumatic stress in anyone here. So it's called simply Storm. And it's a true story. Yankee cynicism crumbles in the face of a winter storm, a proper blizzard that sends New Englanders into fitful reenactments of Rockwell paintings. At the grocery store, it's the Book of Revelations in the hoarding of milk gallons and farm eggs, ice picks and batteries, road salt and signal flares, Swiss Miss and Velveeta. Little else brings life pause, makes us stare from frosted windows at the ordinary abyss, heartsick as King Lear or Jimmy Stewart, patriarchs down on their luck but richly eloquent, that old trope of white fantasia. But here's a true story. I owe my existence to the blizzard of 1978. My parents, having courted for years, found themselves in separate states, towns, all highways shut down. My mother, giving up her car, took shelter at Girl Scout headquarters, where they ate cookies, swapped stories, kept warm. My father worked as a teacher by day, janitor by night, earning more money cleaning latrines than he did teaching the Odyssey or the subjunctive. Something in him leveled during that storm, and he took the first train from Boston to Providence. Heartsick, not yet a patriarch, a little deranged on the heaths, he proposed at the station, though not on one knee and not with a ring, having been ignored by the jeweler when he showed up in his uniform, hard cash in hand, smudge of soot on his chest, his eye on a sapphire. He asked with the certainty of love at odds with circumstance, one that has known such frustration, it's grown its own stubbornness. He didn't dress it up. He said, "We should get married." My mother looked at damp Odysseus, sprung from his working class Mediterranean, and did not reply in the subjunctive. When, she asked, implying a foregone conclusion. As soon as possible, my father said, breathless in fever or asthma, his lungs exhaling an epic catalog of relief when they married simply that summer. The next year I tumbled forth, a mewling emergency, a bundle of subjunctive, hell-bent on backward travel and dead reckoning. Now, almost 40 years later, I know it takes a storm as violent as peace, as pliable as water, to make that species of love leave its platonic sky, sail its wilderness, find hallowed ground, and shut the rest of town straight down. Thank you.
I have to say these are hard acts to follow. I want to remind those of you who are a part of the JMU community of what a treasure you have here in Furious Flower. This is such a rich contribution to the history of American poetry. I hope you recognize this. You should be keeping records of everything that you go to that has something to do with Furious Flower, because it's a unique contribution. I keep thinking about all of those histories of the Harlem Renaissance, all those photographs of all of those great writers who were just writers at that point, and how they made history, and people who kept track of their activities, their appearances, were keeping history. They were historians, sort of inadvertently. And you should be taking pictures of these people here in this row here. I will read just for a few minutes. I don't want to read too long. I'll read first because I said already that I'm interested in ekphrastic poetry, poetry about art, and that this is what Heather and I have in common. And so I thought I would read a couple of recent poems I've written about artists. So I'm going to read two. The first one is about Edmonia Lewis, who was a they used to say sculptress, a sculptor. She was born in 1844 and died in 1907. Her background was half Chippewa and half Haitian. She was born in 1844 in upstate New York, and much of her childhood was spent with her mother's Chippewa family making trinkets and selling baskets, little baskets, and things like that, selling them at Niagara Falls. And then I won't tell her whole story. It's really interesting. You could Google her. It's Edmonia Lewis. She recognized a gift that she had when she was in her 20s. She started sculpting with stone, and she went to Rome to be a sculptor. And this is a poem which catches her in Rome in about maybe about 1875, something like that. So it's really, I think, important to see her and the time she was writing in. Again, her name is Edmonia Lewis, and here she is. I quickly outstripped my mentor's meager skills at roughing out and shaping drawing room busts. Now I cut marble with my self-made tools, and it draws its first breath in a cloud of dust. Rasping alabaster with my strong brown hands, I discover who hides in the white stone. Hammer and chisel beat a percussive dance that helps me to briefly forget I am alone, the orphaned daughter of two despised races, an eternal exile, a Haitian Chippewa in Rome. Stone speaks to me in earth's ancient voice. It tells me I'll be known, but will know no home. Masked like a bandit, I chip mute figures free to speak in beautiful the pain of history. Thank you. Thank you. This is another ekphrastic poem. It's based on a poem acquired recently by the Metropolitan Museum of Art by Carrie James Marshall, an African-American painter whose characteristic paintings have, they're all about black characters, black figures, and they're black in his paintings. And this poem is based on the one that's at the Met. It's called Studio. And it is his studio, a communal studio where he paints. He's from Chicago, I think. So this is an artist studio in Chicago, but it's a studio of a community of artists. In the foreground, there is an unfinished portrait, and the painter, a young black woman, is fixing her model who is seated. She's sort of changing the angle of her chin. So that's in the foreground, along with a table full of paints and stuff. And then in the background, there is a nude man who's clearly a model, and two other men, one of whom is putting on his jacket, getting ready to leave, and the other one, I don't remember what he's doing, but it's artists at work, studio, black artists at work. In this space of laboratory quiet, artists as focused as the kitchen staff of a 4-star Michelin guide restaurant give themselves up to organized chaos. They were born with a compulsion deeper than skin deep, deeper than black. Every cell of their bodies says, "Make art." Their hearts repeat, "Make art, make art, make art." Here in the studio's silence, artists demonstrate that freedom means exploring unlimited potential, playing a part in creation. How beautiful the human body is, how complex light is on black skin, how a story can emerge from colors, how a yellow curve can become a dog. Whether you're a woman, whether you're black, no matter who you are, you can make art. Art rebuilds our hope for a shared future. It restores our courage, revives our faith. Here in the studio, as on cave walls, our species reaches toward undying truths. Every work of art was once unfinished, part in this world, part imagined. Thank you. Thank you. I've been writing sonnets, and maybe I'll read this one and then I'll read this sonnet. It's a sonnet I wrote starting on Easter this year. If you were brought to life again after the great escape from pain and empathy into freedom from fear, would you wake eager, or would weariness make you want to turn over, close your eyes, and snuggle into the soft grave covers? What love that loved you back could repay you for looking out through disappointed eyes? Could joy recompense for the brokenness around you, the ice in your breaking heart? What prophet would accept the punishment of being called again to prophesy, ignored, sneered at, and stoned for seeing how we help creation uncreate itself? Jesus, twice born brother, did you ask this? Thank you. I'm going to read two older poems and then read something that's more recent. This is from a book called The Freedom Business, which is about a man named Venture Smith who lived in New England in the mid to early 18th century. He was a witness to the American Revolution. He was born in West Africa, captured as a 14-year-old, brought to America. He was purchased by someone on the crew of the slave ship. And then he served for 40 years in slavery. And then he was allowed to purchase his freedom. And then he purchased his children. And then together with his children, he purchased his wife. And then he went into the freedom business, buying people and setting them free. And he is a local hero. I used to live in the town in Connecticut where he's buried, and where every year for many years there is a Venture Smith Day, and his descendants, 7th and 8th generation descendants, come to celebrate his life. Actually, in a recent episode of Henry Louis Gates' television program, So You Think You Know Your Family, something like that, he was doing, who was it? A white actor, a television actor. Gates discovered that this man's 5 great-grandfather was the man who he owned Venture Smith, and he allowed him to do extra work and save his money and purchase his freedom. And this man had no idea of that how much this one gesture changed 8 generations of Venture Smith's family. They've been free for 8 generations. So I'm sorry, I've talked too much. This is a poem. I'm going to read 2 poems about Venture Smith. This one is dated 1790. It's called Farm Garden, and I think I've told you enough background. By the time I was 36, I had been sold 3 times. I had spun money out of sweat. I'd been cheated and beaten. I had paid an enormous sum for my freedom. And 10 years farther on, I've come out here to my garden at the first faint hint of light to inventory the riches I now hold. My potatoes look fine, and my corn, my squash, my beans. My tobacco is strutting, spreading its velvety wings. My cabbages are almost as big as my head. From labor and luck, I have much profited. I wish I could remember those praise songs we used to dance to with the sacred drums. My rooster is calling my hens from my stone wall. In my meadow, my horses and my cows look up, then graze again. My orchard boasts green fruit. Yes, everything I own is dearly bought, but gratitude is a never-emptying cup. My life equal measures pain and windfall. My effigies to scare raccoons and crows frown fiercely, wearing a clattering fringe of shells, like dancers in the, what did we call it? Dance. My wife and 2 of my children stir in my house. For one 30 years enslaved, I have done well. I am free and clear, not 1 penny do I owe. I own myself, a $500 man, and $2,000 worth of family. Of canoes and boats right now, I own 29. 70 acres of bountiful land is mine. God or gods, thanks for raining these blessings on me. I turn around slowly. I own everything I scan. Thank you. I'm only going to read that one. I'm going to skip the other one because I don't want to read too long. Just one other note. Venture Smith told his life story in a book that was published in 1798. You can find the whole thing online. It was one of the first books published in, at least in Connecticut, but surely one of the first books published in the United States, in the colonies. No, it was, by then I guess it was the States. I'm going to end with a completely different book. It's a family story. My family and I had Thanksgiving last year with our first cousins. We had never had Thanksgiving with them before. And the entire time we were together, my sister kept telling and retelling, to the annoyance of our cousins, a story about the time our 4 male cousins took our younger brother into the attic of their house, tied him to the chimney, and left him and forgot he was there. He was about 5 or 6, and my sister, several hours later, heard him crying and went up and freed him. She kept telling the story, and the cousins, who are all in their 60s now, all right, Jennifer, you've told us the story again. So this is a story that takes off from that. They told him that there was a floating baby in the attic, that the attic was haunted by a floating baby. And this is called the floating baby. A doll was forgotten in a bedroom when the old owners of the house moved out and Gma and Gramps moved their family in. There's an old photograph in an album of boy Uncle Roy laughing, holding it in a jumble of moving in boxes. It spent 30 years on the shelf in the hall closet, a reminder of the history of the house. It was graduated up to the attic the day Gma made the last house payment. There's a framed photo of that day, Gma surrounded by handsome men sons. My cousins and I sit in the parlor, paging through albums. Photos on the walls capture special events, celebrations. The grown-up voices drift across the hall, Dad and the uncles sharing memories, 2 aunts calling from the kitchen. The cousins whisper about the floating baby. My dad says he was always scared of that doll. Yeah, and my dad says he thought it carried the rage the before us owners felt when they sold the house to Gramps and Gma. You'd open the closet door even in August and feel the rage chill. 10 minutes alone in the attic, the cousins say, and the floating baby floats up from behind the boxes and spider webs. They've all seen her, a plump pink baby doll with wide blue eyes puckering up and holding out her arms. Just 10 minutes alone up there, you scared? Just 10 minutes alone, the cousins coax. Come on, it's our family tradition. The attic's up 2 flights of stairs lined with sad-looking wallpaper. Where we live, houses don't have inside steps or basements or second floors or attics. I walk in front, hand on the banister. We pass Malcolm, Dr. King, and Barack and Michelle Obama. Weddings, babies. We pass a scroll called the Serenity Prayer. Young Dad holds his thumbs up before I was born, and it feels like he's looking straight at me. Omari leads us up the attic stairs into a cold, dark, raftered open space where plastic clothes bags hang from a garment rack and trunks and boxes gape open here and there. The other cousins huddle together. I ask myself, am I a fraidy cat? I pick up a few old hardcover books and some brittle-page Browning paperbacks and put them back. Look one by one through a pile of kid art signed in crayon. The cousins have stopped whispering. I am alone. I hear feet rumbling down the stairs. I find a bundle of stamped envelopes addressed in cursive to Gma as Miss. I'm standing there concentrating on untying the knots when light falls on something in the shadows, the floating baby. You know what? She looks just like my friend Evan's baby sister. I pick her up and put her in a box on top of some books and old report cards. I find a fake fur jacket in the garment bag and tuck her under it so she looks warm. If she was carrying rage, it's time to stop. Evan's baby sister can say my name. I hear them calling, "Dinner is served." I run downstairs, wash my hands, take my place. The cousins grin at me and raise their thumbs. Jima tells Uncle John to say the grace. She tells Uncle Roy to carve the bird. She says, "Y'all remember to save room for my pie." Thank you.